Hello! Vince Vitale has done some great work on the non-identity theodicy, which I think is frankly underappreciated. I'm going to present it while giving my own spin on it, but before answering why does God allow evil, we're going to need to sort out some background philosophy. Let's start out with a simple paradox. Jim is a child who grows up and becomes an adult. He is older, wiser, maybe he has a beard. Point is, he's different now. So this beardless child here is Jim, and this bearded adult in the future is also Jim. But how can they both be Jim if they aren't identical? They have different properties, yet are both Jim. This may not be too paradoxical, but let's try and be really precise with the answer. Philosophers divide all properties into two categories: essential and non-essential properties. Non-essential properties are also called accidental properties. A non-essential property is a property which something might happen to have, but it could also lack it. An essential property, on the other hand, is a property which something must have for its identity. As an example, a beard is non-essential because Jim could either have it or lack it and still be Jim. It's not required for Jim's identity. However, the property of being human is arguably essential. If Jim exists, he must exist as a human. He couldn't be a book or a math equation or something. Coolio. Now let's move on to another philosophical question. Could there be two of you? I'm not asking if it's possible for there to be another person who looks a lot like you. That's obviously possible. I'm asking if there could be another person who was actually you. It seems that it isn't possible. If there could be two yous, then exactly one of them could be bearded. But then you could truly say, I am bearded, and truly say, I am not bearded at the same time. That's really weird. So no, there could not be two yous. That tells us something about our essential properties. They can only show up in one individual. It would be impossible for all your essential properties to also be in a second individual. But why? Why can't that happen? What essential property do you have that can't be replicated in another individual? Well, here's one answer. Your origin is an essential property. The specific way you were created is an essential part of who you are. There's some intuitive plausibility to this. If we compare you to a clone of you who is identical down to the molecular level, we would say that you're the original simply because of where you came from. You came from your parents, and they came from a cloning machine. So maybe your origin is an essential property. Now, how narrowly defined is your origin when we say that your origin is an essential property of you? Is it just that you need to come from the specific parents which you do in fact come from? Or is it that you also need to be conceived at the specific moment which you in fact were conceived at? Or do you also need to be conceived at the specific location which you were conceived at? And so on. If we wanted to take this all the way and say that a super specific description of your origin is actually an essential property, then that would mean that the exact specific state of affairs leading up to the moment where you were created would be necessary for your existence. Representing all possible worlds as branching timelines, that means that you can only come into existence at one specific point in the entire branching network. Now, here's a question that will bring us back to Theodicies. What if God wants to create you specifically? Well, he would need to create a thing with all your essential properties to do that. And in this framework, that means getting to that one specific point on the branching timeline. However, that means that God would be required to create the portion of the timeline leading up to your existence. There's no way around it for God, even if that chunk of timeline leading up to your creation contains evil. So if God wanted to create you in particular, he would have needed to allow the evil to exist. We can use this to answer our original question. Why does God allow evil? He does so that you can exist, as well as everyone else. See, if everyone's origin is essential to them, then only in our specific, suffering-filled world could God have brought about our existences. Under this theodicy, God treats the existence of specific individuals as ends in of themselves rather than means to an end. He decides to create us for our sakes and allows the evil in the world so that we can exist. And once everyone has been brought into existence, God can intervene to destroy all evil, and we can partake in God's offer for a suffering-free eternity. This theodicy has a couple perks. First, it works for animal pain just as well as human pain. The animals could only come into existence in a suffering-filled ecosystem, but God can resurrect them into a suffering-free paradise. Also, none of this theodicy relies on free will at all. Even if we don't have free will, this theodicy works just fine. Now, the way I've presented the theodicy so far assumes that your super specific origin is essential to you. This can be weakened to a somewhat specific origin being essential to you, and the theodicy would still work, but that gets really complicated. We would need to get into Hexaetism and Traducianism and a bunch of other stuff, so I'm not going to get into that here. The point is, the theist needs to accept a theory of personal identity, which makes a suffering-filled past leading up to their creation essential for their existence. But there are a couple of ways this can be done by accepting some weaker premises. We'll consider one last objection here. Sure, the only world where God can get the specific individual person's X, Y, Z, and so on is in our world filled with suffering. But aren't there worlds filled with no suffering and full of pleasure available to God with different persons? That other world would be better, wouldn't it? So surely God would opt to create that other world. Well, a problem with that logic is that no matter which available world we're considering, there may always be a better world than it. Another world with one more person feeling a bit more pleasure. If that's the case, and there is no best world, then considerations about the existence of better worlds would leave God in a gridlock, unable to create any world. So it seems that God would need to debar comparing a world to others when considering whether or not to create it. Furthermore, it seems that this objection is mischaracterizing God's intentions. God's goal isn't the maximization of pleasure. The goal is the specific individuals themselves who God decides to create. Also, their existences constitute goods that don't appear in any other world, which justifies its creation despite suffering. And he doesn't wrong anyone who doesn't exist because you need to exist to be wronged. In conclusion, a theist could maintain that God has a perfectly legitimate reason for allowing evil at the relatively small cost of adopting a certain theory of personal identity. That's the end of this video. Thanks for watching. Please consider subscribing or supporting me on Patreon if you enjoy this content.